Welcome back to the Fat and the Devious podcast. Today will just be me. Today we'll be talking about the merits of psychedelics in psychiatry. I don't have anyone with me today. It'll just be me. I just wanted to make sure I have a kind of more concise approach to what I'm going to say. And I would like to say a few things before I get on main topic. I was going to go and record this outside. It's just really nice outside and it's kind of cool. I don't think crickets have really come out yet, though. But the one day I want to go and record outside, my neighbors are blasting Queen of all things, which they never do. They never make that much noise. But the one day I want to go outside, they're blasting music. And something I would like to start doing on these episodes is go over some current events. Recently, Donald Trump said he wants Putin to halt any sort of war with Ukraine, which is weird because he seems to kind of switch sides all the time. He tries to play both sides, which really doesn't benefit anyone. First, he's obviously had this connection with Russia for years, whether it's, the accusations of his codename being Krasnov, the election, or just in general, disinformation being put against the Harris campaign in his favor. Whatever way you slice it, it's just his connection to Russia seems to be positive from his perspective. He seems to be very much in favor of Russia, so it's hard for him to really take a side. In the case of Zelensky, he was antagonizing him, making it almost sound like it was his fault. Same with J.D. Vance, who was the last person the Pope talked to before he died. Not the last guy I would ever want to talk to before I died. And then now he's making it sound like Russia is in the wrong, which they obviously are. And there was a temporary Easter ceasefire in Ukraine. And they had made propositions like that earlier before. I think Russia wanted to have a Christmas ceasefire a little while ago. But Ukraine didn't trust them. And, I don't blame them. It seems like a psyop. And in other news, this is kind of old news, but I haven't mentioned it on the podcast yet. There is some evidence of alien life being found on a planet called K2-18b, which is 120 light years from Earth. And I'm not don't have all the details, but from what I understand is that K2-18b is, they have these telescopes which they can see pretty far away, and they usually get data basically as planets based on how the light reacts to the planet. So the light, the way they saw it, they couldn't really find a reason for why the light reacts that way on that planet. It's a water planet, and they think, there's no real explanation. They think the only solution so far that has promise would be that there's alien algae on the planet. Not actual algae. In fact, I was discussing this with someone the other day. We were trying to say, would alien life even classify on, kingdom, phylum, class, that whole classification system? And it would probably have to classify somewhere else because it wouldn't even be Mammalia, Animalia, those broad categories, because it would just be completely removed. And personally, I think it'd be really interesting to see what the cellular structure of alien life would be. Because, for example, mitochondria was engulfed by cells, and that's what, becomes the powerhouse. So what would the evolutionary equivalent be convergently on a different planet? It's very interesting how their cell structure would work, or the adaptations based on their environmental pressure. That being said, the media is very quick to go at these kinds of stories. There is not much skepticism because, whether it's New Jersey drones, government disclosure, or actual scientific research, the media will just jump the gun and start, telling people what they want to hear in the headlines or in the article itself, because it makes them money. They generate revenue based on ads. When they tell people there's alien life, they profit from that. They're not going to report the truth. It's like the Shroud of Turin. There's multiple explanations. People will say, oh, it's the Shroud of Christ, it's a medieval forgery, or, oh, well, it could have been the shroud used for Jesus Christ, but it would have taken 1 billion watts of light, worth of light to create. So Christians will probably choose one that benefits their bias, that atheists will choose the one that benefits their bias, but then the media will just choose whatever position they can get the most ad revenue from, and then that becomes a predominant position. Same here. There's other explanations proposed. I think there was one idea that could have been volcanic activity or some sort of naturally occurring chemical compound, which is unlikely, but it just depends. What's more unlikely? Finding that chemical compound on an alien planet, or not an alien planet, just on a planet, or finding actual aliens on that planet. It just comes down to probability at that point and what people are willing to believe. Right now, the research seems too early for me to really figure it out. And I honestly doubt we'll ever be able to know for a while because it's 120 light years away. Even if we're going at the speed of light, which is impossible, it'll take us 120 years. So that seems the odds are low. So I think in the future, the way they'll determine it is they'll rule out any other explanation. Then they'll go with aliens until they can find a better explanation. But even then, that's not really an answer, in my opinion. But I am still curious and optimistic. We've talked about aliens on this podcast before, I think, briefly, and we'll have more to say about that in the future. And with those current events being said, I would like to get into the actual material. The merits of psychedelic research have been long debated, especially after the hippie movement and MKUltra. While some critics of psychedelics argue that psychedelics are dangerous and lack benefit, ongoing research shows the opposite. There's the type of thing I'm thinking of here is when I contrast psychedelic research with MKUltra. I mean, we haven't talked about MKUltra. Well, yes, we have actually talked about MKUltra on this podcast. It was one of the first episodes, but we were kind of just not making stuff up. We were kind of just going off the top of our head. And MKUltra, NK Naomi, Project Artichoke, Project Monarch, which the evidence for Project Monarch, it doesn't really add up in my opinion, but it's interesting nonetheless. I will just give a brief description of MKUltra. MKUltra started off in Germany during World War II. This kind of relates to Operation Paperclip. Operation Paperclip was when German scientists were hired under the U.S. government to continue their research. So the moon landing was made possible from Nazi scientists just seeking asylum in the United States. And, regardless of how you feel about that, we did get to the moon, unless you don't believe we got to the moon, which there's worse things to believe out there, I guess, better than flat Earth. Anyways, so MKUltra was unethical experiments done on unethical and non-consensual experiments done on U.S. citizens. You might, for example, you might be at a college, you may have signed up for something, and then before you know it, you're in a dark basement getting injected with weird substances, and you're on LSD in a sensory deprivation tank, and you're really hungry and haven't eaten for days. And this was a big scandal back in the day. Like the way MKUltra was discovered was there were tax forms and a lot of other documents that were stored in the wrong area of a government building. And then the guy who discovered it, he sent it to the press, and then it was presented before Congress. It was a massive scandal. And then a lot of the victims were compensated, but only some of them. Other ones they were saying like, oh, you weren't abused enough to be recuperated, to be given money. But that's kind of weird. How do you play that game? How much abuse is enough abuse to get compensation? I just think anyone involved should have gotten compensation. And there was projects, subsidiary projects like there. Operation Midnight Climax is really just hiring prostitutes to have sex with random people on the street, and then they would drug who they're having sex with, and then the CIA would watch from one-way mirrors. It's a wild one. Anyways, I would like to contrast this with modern psychedelic research, which is professionally done, and there was professional research being done. Albert Hofmann was the guy who discovered LSD, and prior to stuff like MKUltra and the hippie movement, people like Albert Hofmann, like he was a chemist, they were doing some professional research, and prior to, like I said, hippie movement and MKUltra, it was stuff like peyote was used spiritually. It was kind of like a spiritual context by Native Americans for years, generationally, and it has spiritual significance in plenty of cultures. So modern research in no way is reminiscent of previous unethical research, which really killed the reputation, as well as recreational research. Personally, I think that we could definitely legalize psychedelics recreationally. There's no real harm. It's not like cocaine or heroin or meth. It's just, you just use it and you trip and then you are done. It's not addictive. I mean, sure, it could get laced, but if it's being sold legally, then there'd be regulations against putting harmful stuff in it, and it would keep keep people out of prison, and people could have spiritual experiences as well. So there's more benefit than there would be harm. I'm not saying we need to legalize like datura, but stuff like low dosages of LSD peyote is already legalized for certain Native American churches, and you just show up and you take it, and then it's like their sacrament basically. I mean, it's not 1-to-1, but there are some spiritual applications which it does have that are legal in certain places. So why not have a more wide legalization, even recreationally? But I would like to say recreational use is kind of outside the scope of what I'm saying here, but I'm not saying I'm opposed to it. It's just not really the discussion that's going on in this episode. But I'm still open to it. Although I probably wouldn't do it myself, to be clear. There's some more risks recreationally versus professionally. And we'll get into those, how the differences between recreational versus professional are. Despite the bad reputation of psychedelics, non-recreational use of various hallucinogens such as psilocybin, DMT, mescaline, and LSD those are the classical hallucinogens. There's classical hallucinogens, which are like, psilocybin, DMT, mescaline, LSD, and then, non-classical ones would probably be like datura, some other ones. I'm not as familiar with the non-classical ones because those get a bit more extreme. Or like devil's breath, but that's like kind of more of an urban legend. The urban legend is basically that you can take it and then you're way suggestible. Like people can just tell you to just empty out your pockets, they can rob you. But these accounts are mainly unsubstantiated. There was one guy, he got a devil's breath, like he took it, and then someone told him to empty out his whole apartment. And then for the next 2 hours, he emptied out his whole apartment, and the guy stole it all. And then when he stopped, he wasn't on the influence of it anymore. He walked into his apartment and was confused where it all went. And then he asked his landlord, and on security footage it showed that he was taking it all out for 2 hours straight, and he had no memory of it. But these accounts, like I say, are mainly urban legend and somewhat unsubstantiated. And I should say that the main idea behind MK Ultra was that you would be suggestible and it was like mind control. So, and for a few reasons, LSD isn't really very good for mind control. It can make you, trip. It can make you hallucinate and see all this stuff, or it might have certain effects. Like you might experience sounds as images, just kind of like interesting effects like that. People like to take LSD when they're listening to music or watching like funny movies, that kind of thing. But it doesn't really you're not suggestible under it. I mean, the whole idea of a truth serum isn't really substantiated. So I don't think devil's breath would really work because that's not really what psychedelics do. But we will see later how it can maybe help you reach a different state of mind to help you with some issues. And we'll get to that. The first source illustrates, destigmatizing would be, there's a TED Talk by Rick Doblin, and it is called The Future of Psychedelic Assisted Psychotherapy. And a bit of a distinction here. If you ever see a TED Talk versus a TEDx talk, in TED Talks there's actually, a high bar to get there. But then TEDx is just like anyone at their local university can just go to TEDx. So people will say, oh, I spoke for TED. The question should always be, okay, well, TED or TEDx? A lot of people try and sound smart by saying they gave a TED Talk, but it's only a TEDx talk, which is a pretty low bar. But this is a TED Talk, so it is a high bar. So there's something. In the talk, he advocates for the legalization of MDMA, also known as Molly or ecstasy, for use in psychotherapy. The example that stands out in the talk is a former patient named Tony, who was at the timestamp 935, who was a veteran diagnosed with PTSD. Tony had been resistant to treatment options for PTSD and his experience using MDMA was positive and helped him overcome his PTSD, since it would help him reach into their frame of mind. So this is a kind of a common thing. If you think about a time you told someone about something that's bugging you, and they give you a solution, and you can't really wrap your head around thinking that way. Like someone may say, you may be having trouble with your roommate or your coworker, and you're saying, oh, they're just getting on my nerves so much. And then, someone might say, well, maybe you should just try being nice to them. Maybe some positivity could help, but you're just so fixated on just how much you dislike them that you just can't envision trying to show them kindness to help the situation. But obviously in the situation, LSD would be a big jump. But I'm saying when you can't understand that perspective because you're just so fixed in your perspective, something like psychedelics could help you understand it, come to a different understanding based on, think of LSD or these psychedelics kind of like the developer mode in like a laptop or a phone. Like if you were jailbreak your phone, or you like mod your Wii, or add a mod chip to your PlayStation 1, that kind of thing. Like you're getting just additional capabilities for the base system based on this modification. So you can do more things in developer mode on your computer versus just normally. And that might sound like a weird comparison, but that's the best I can illustrate, because, stuck in this one perspective, just without these substances, it may be hard to get a different perspective, but then once you go into developer mode, going with the comparison, you gain these extra capabilities, and you'll be able to see it from a different perspective because of how these substances are targeting your brain, usually the 5-HT receptors in the brain. And, once you have that stimulation in those particular parts of the brain, because it has kind of strange effects on the brain. It's not really seen as dangerous, but it is kind of still unknown, because like I said, this research was stigmatized for a while. So now we're kind of we're just barely starting to learn a lot of the stuff, and it's promising. But there are still some unknowns, and I will acknowledge that. So your brain is working in a different way, and when your brain is just operating differently, you'll be able to see things differently too. And maybe that's the kind of change you needed the whole time, once you can adopt a new perspective. So going with the earlier example, you might be able to see once you're under psychedelics that maybe you were wrong the whole time. Maybe you did need to just be more nice to your coworker or your roommate, and your friend's advice was right the whole time. It's just your bias that was holding you back. And once you go into a different frame of mind, you can understand these different concepts without the bias you were holding on to within that state of mind. So Tony was not under the use, that's probably not the right term. He was being treated with MDMA, and I should say that Rick Doblin's association was a multidisciplinary association for psychedelic studies, and Tony was just a patient of his, or a client. Sometimes, psychiatry, you don't really want to call clients patients, because it makes it sound like they're, going to like the doctor or there's something wrong with them. But, people with mental issues are still people. So client is the word, not patient. He was undergoing treatment with MDMA, and Tony had PTSD from his time in the military, and he witnessed his friends dying. And when he was treatment resistant, which is a common theme. He couldn't just move on. He was really having a hard time understanding a lot of these treatments, or they just weren't working for him, So he used MDMA to kind of enter this new state of mind. And when within psychology, Wilhelm Wundt is probably the first psychologist, and he came up with introspection. Introspection is kind of a minimalist form of psychiatry, or I guess, psychiatry. And it's basically just analyzing your internal experience as objectively as possible. So, for example, going back with the coworker example, your friend's telling you need to be nice to him because you're having a hard time with him, but you just can't because he's just so mean to you. You can't picture being nice to him. With introspection, you would try and suspend your bias best you can. I mean, that's impossible because, we're only human, but you would try and suspend your bias as much as possible, look at it objectively. So you'd say, okay, so he's been mean to me at work. Well, what am I doing that's making it bad? Saying, well, I did say this to him. I'm escalating. I'm using a harsh tone with him. Okay, well, now let's think about it from his perspective. Yes, he's a bit short-tempered, and he's a little bit annoying, but, maybe I'm making the problem worse. I'm doing the same thing. Well, how can I make it better? Well, maybe being nice to him. Maybe I need some kind of micro goal. Maybe I need to find some common ground and build from that. So that would be an example. You're trying to think of it objectively, opposed to something like, well, he's being mean to me, so I need to be mean to him back to make myself feel good because that's just justice or something. So that's how introspection works. So introspection aided with psychedelic substances, in this case MDMA. So like I said, it's impossible to suspend your bias unless you get a new opinion or a new schema and whatever. You're assimilating new knowledge for your schema, and you can get a new one. But so the MDMA helps him put in that frame of mind. So when he's applying introspection, he can suspend his bias more so and learn more about what conditions are prompting this response. And he's looking through his mind, and he's thinking, well, why do I have PTSD? And he's thinking, well, I watched all my friends die. But why does that response go to make me have PTSD? He's thinking, well, in my case, I have PTSD because I want to remember my friends, kind of like survivorship guilt there. And he was thinking about that, and he thought, well, I'm trying to remember my friends. Well, what would my friends want? I'm trying to remember them, and I can remember them because I doubt he could ever, forget that. You can't forget watching someone die in front of you. He's thinking, well, what would they think? And he's thinking, well, my friends would want me to remember them, sure, but they'd also want me to live my life. They wouldn't want me to be fixated on their final moments to the detriment of my own life. So he realized that he needed to, he realized his friends would have wanted him to live his life. And from that perspective, under MDMA, he realized then that made his PTSD go away. And I'm not saying that's universal across all PTSD patients. There's PTSD that can form from a lot of things, rape, abuse, childhood abuse, maybe, usually in the name post-traumatic stress disorder, some sort of trauma that can be being robbed at gunpoint. It's usually like an event, it's not just something minor like, oh, I stubbed my toe, or I got hit in the ankle with a scooter, something like that. It's trauma that you're being kind of re-traumatizing yourself because it keeps coming back. Often there's flashbacks or, anxiety attacks, that kind of thing. And I'm not saying this is universal across all of them, but in his experience, he said his friends wanted him to live his life. So that's how he overcame it. And, for I'm not saying everyone with PTSD needs to get like ketamine injections, or everyone has to use MDMA. I'm saying that, there are people who are resistant to treatment. There's people who can't get past abuse. There's people who can't get past their addictions, that kind of thing. So it might be it's a bit of a jump. Like first therapy session, your therapist says, hey, have you ever tried Molly? Be like, what? But, if you're just, literally nothing is helping you, then this is just another option that could help. And, there's other stuff like sensory deprivation tanks. I know that sounds like a weird thing, and I'm sure we'll talk about John C. Lilly eventually on this podcast, the guy who started the research on talking to dolphins, and his books were wild, believe me. John C. Lilly invented the sensory deprivation tank, and I know this sounds crazy, but he would sit the sensory deprivation tank on LSD and then try to communicate psychically with the woman who was training the dolphins how to speak English. And, the research was eventually kind of disregarded because he started ruining everything. He started injecting the dolphins with LSD. It was just a whole mess. And his books started getting more and more kind of out there. But sensory deprivation tanks, first I should say what sensory deprivation tanks are. It's basically you sit in a tank and the water's at room temperature. All the lights are off, and you're just floating in the dark in like the tank. And so basically the only stimulation is just your mind. So you're just being closed off to other stimulation like sound, touch, things you see. You just like lay there and just it's just your brain basically talking to itself. So it kind of gives you solace, and then you can kind of, people do it just kind of like they do like yoga or something like that. They just do it just to better themselves. In some cases, some people do it out of curiosity, but some people, they think it's like an actual treatment option for, different conditions. And I'm skeptical of it for being widely used. And it seems a bit odd from my perspective, but for people who are looking for something, like literally anything that can help them, then it becomes more of a palatable option once you're kind of looking for something, literally anything to help you. And it doesn't hurt you. It's like same with psychedelic psychiatry. It can benefit you in the long run, so it's worth a shot if you are resistant to more conventional means of treatment. So, let me just get my thoughts together real fast. So in addition to psychedelics showing benefit in the treatment of PTSD, psychedelics have also shown promise in treating neurotic symptoms. Juan Jose Fuentes details in his article how, and his article is called Therapeutic Use of LSD in Psychiatry, a Systematic Review of Randomized Controlled Clinical Trials. And in that article, he details how not United States dollars. Yeah, inflation is, well, with tariffs, stuff's going to get worse. But at least tariffs are on pause for now. I think tariffs should be put on, like, China, not, like, Mexico or Canada, but it's beyond the point. He details how LSD can be used to treat neurotic symptoms, such as depressive neurosis, hysteria, obsessive-compulsive reaction, etc. The test also had a group undergoing LSD treatment and a control group with an active placebo. So, yeah, this kind of thing, most people know what a placebo is, but in this case, it's very important because let's say I give you, like, marijuana, and I say, all right, here's marijuana, tell me your experience. And they're like, okay, well, everything started to feel kind of odd, everything kind of started to slow down, and then I say, okay, cool, well, I actually gave you placebo, I actually gave you oregano, like the stuff you use for cooking, like, then it's just placebo, then you psychologically thought it was marijuana because that's what you thought the substance was. You convinced yourself and you started feeling those symptoms, the effects of marijuana because you just convinced yourself it was marijuana. So that's why it's important to have an active placebo. So then when you give people these substances, they don't just convince themselves it's true. So then you're not, that way you can tell if it's not working or not. So they'll give them like a sugar pill or that kind of thing. Or there's different ways to ingest different psychedelic substances. You can get it injected. It has to enter like your circulation in your body. The slowest method is you take it orally, just in the mouth. There'll often be like LSD stamps, a pill sometimes. Sometimes people will just, I don't know, like in the case of the Beatles, the dentist, one of the guys' dentists, just snuck it into like their water, and then they started like tripping, and they're like, well, that was, instead of being mad, they're like, oh, that was so cool, where can we get more of this? And then, that's, I think, in my opinion, that's when that's kind of like the issue with the Beatles, like, what was the song? I Am the Walrus. Just complete nonsense. I don't like the Beatles, but, songs like Strawberry Fields Forever or Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, the songs that make, Strawberry Fields Forever isn't that bad in terms of, like, it being, like, surreal, but, like, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds or I Am the Walrus, like, what the heck does those songs even mean? It makes sense now, they're on LSD, but they very much deny that. They will not admit that they use LSD because, they were bad. That was back in the 60s. Nowadays, supposedly LSD is bad, but, obviously, this episode we're trying to destigmatize that, but, or if you watch the movie, like, Yellow Submarine, there's a lot of, surreal elements to it. People often watch that movie on LSD. Another interesting thing, just while I was doing research for all this, was people watch the show Cosmos by Carl Sagan while on LSD. I guess there's like a lot of kind of psychedelic visuals with like all the cosmology shown, like the astronomy. I don't think cosmology is the word. All the astronomy shown in the series, and then just all the kind of like stuff that's shown. Like, there's an episode on the brain. It's an episode on the Library of Alexandria. I mean, I know this because I watched it growing up. It's a good show. Then Neil deGrasse Tyson one is good too, but first one's better in my opinion. So in addition to neurotic symptoms, such as depressive neurosis, hysteria, obsessive compulsive reaction, the test had a group undergoing LSD treatment and a control group with an active placebo. I already went over that. LSD group showed improvement 6 to 12 months after the test. Yeah, so checkups are also important. There's an issue with some of this research involving retention. So I might have, one example we'll see later on is alcoholism, and, treating alcohol abuse or addiction as a disorder is a little problematic. There's a South Park episode about it. Sometimes stuff like this gets treated like it's a disorder or a condition when really it's just something that needs to be treated as an addiction rather than a disorder like cerebral palsy. I mean, cerebral palsy is different than alcohol addiction. Alcohol addiction is very severe. There's withdrawals and other stuff. I mean, people will say they have certain addictions. Like, the difference between a habit and addiction is an addiction has symptoms, withdrawals, that kind of thing. A habit is just something, you do something long enough and it just becomes a habit, and it's just hard to break the habit because you do it so much. Like overeating. Like, you eat so much that you're just used to eating. You eat certain, you might say, oh, it's dinner time. And then after dinner, it's just a habit. You just get ice cream and you eat it while watching TV. So if you break that habit, you'll just you might crave ice cream for a while, but eventually you'll break the habit. But you're not going to go through any withdrawals, like smoking. So someone could say, oh, I have an eating addiction. That's not an addiction, that's a habit, because there's no withdrawals. It's just you psychologically telling yourself that you need that, and then it keeps continuing. And when you treat it as an addiction, that reinforces the bad behavior. If I tell myself I'm going to go through withdrawals if I don't eat ice cream after dinner, then yeah, it's going to be harder because I'm doing it like I'm quitting a smoking addiction. But it's just a habit. It's not an addiction. That's the difference. So once you view, and sometimes this negative reinforcement this negative cycle can keep people from really kicking these habits. If you're telling yourself, oh, it's just too hard to quit eating, it's an addiction, I feel guilty if I eat, but if I don't, then I just feel terrible. So you're stuck in this negative cycle. But if you just if you just be honest with yourself and you view it like with introspection, if you try and make micro goals, if you try and like short-term goals, or if you try and go like a reward system, like saying, hey, like going cold turkey works for some people who have a lot of motivation. Other people not so much. So saying, like, going with the eating example, you say like, oh, maybe I won't have ice cream this day, but maybe the next day. And I know it's really basic advice, but I'm just giving an example. Obviously, everyone deals with these issues on their own, and I'm not the one to tell people how they need to go about it. So alcohol abuse, I would say it is an addiction because there are withdrawals, there's symptoms, that kind of thing. But treating it as a disorder might be a bit of a leap because that's treating it like something that you can't fix. Like, you'll just relapse. There's nothing you can do. It's just with you forever. But, for a lot of these people, there is a way out for them. They can seek treatment, and that's where this comes in because retention, like I said, with there's withdrawals, there's relapse. Like, if you're coming out hard times, you just haven't really felt anything genuine for a while. You're thinking, well, I did feel something when I was drinking alcohol. So, then suddenly alcohol seems like it's more something seems like a real option again once you're on, rough times. So retention is very important with this research because there can be relapse. Sometimes you'll show short-term improvement, but then, 6 months after you'll lose all your progress, which is sad. But so it showed promising LSD treatment for alcoholism showed promise, if not the 6 to 12 month checkup. And Fuentes later stated The psychedelics have promising results for treating patients with chronic alcoholism, like I just said. He also stated that LSD is very beneficial for short-term improvement. And yes, like I said, like retention shows short-term improvement. The big criticism is that the retention over time is low. But, you know, you need to get motivation somehow. When you're trying to kick an addiction or a habit, motivation is very important. And if you can get ahead short-term, then might be what you need for long-term. Like, you might just need that little boost to get you started. Like, let's say you're running a race and you're a little slow, and then everyone else is running alongside you, but your PE coach gives you maybe like a 20-second or even a 5-second head start from the rest of the class. That's going to help you get ahead because, I mean, sure, 5 seconds may not be much, you know, in the broad scheme of things, but that might just be enough to get you ahead from a certain people, and you might win the race. So same with this, like, even if it's short term, that might just be, you know, the extra 5 seconds, 5-second benefit, or 5 seconds ahead of the class, or the little boost you need, or the motivation to keep going. If you're quitting an alcohol addiction, you might be saying, oh, so what if I can go one day without alcohol? I'll just have to go back on it the next day, or even a week. I'll just be drinking alcohol after that. But if you're starting to say, but then if you're, you know, 2-week mark, 3-week mark, 2-month mark, 3-month mark, that is much more than just 1 or 2 days. That's a pretty good head start to quitting the rest of the addiction. And even though retention rates for alcoholism and that kind of thing have shown retention after the 6 to 12 month mark, there are other areas where retention wasn't as high. I think it was anxiety. It didn't show as much benefit. And, you know, some people use microdosing for anxiety. And I'll just explain this now. Microdosing is taking low amounts of LSD, and then macrodosing is taking high amounts. For psychedelic psychiatry, high amounts are used, so then you can actually feel the effects. Microdosing is mainly used for stuff like creativity, maybe alleviating like social anxiety or just generalized anxiety. But I think microdosing is kind of dumb. Like, do you really need to take a substance, like a drug, to help you be creative? If you're creative, you should just be naturally creative. Like, you know, I heard something once. Some companies outsource their commercials to Colorado because a lot of drugs are legal there. And then the writers from there's always using drugs. So that's why some commercials are so weird and creative, is because everyone's just on drugs while making them. But, you know, I don't think you really need to use drugs to be creative. You can just be naturally creative. I mean, there was a version of the movie Dune that never came out. There was a David Lynch version. There's the current ones. And there's a few other adaptations. Like there's a video game adaptation, the comic books, and a few other things in between. And, of course, the original books as well. But there was also an unmade movie. It had only concept art, but there was a ton of concept art. It was really promising. Actually, let me look up who made this. Okay, I believe is Jodorowsky's Dune. And it's by Alejandro Jodorowsky Prulansky. I would pronounce that correctly. So I believe that's him, unless there's multiple unmade Dune movies, which wouldn't surprise me. Basically, he, for the concept art, he used tons of like LSD and drugs to like help himself visualize just the sheer scope of the movie. Because Frank Herbert, when he made Dune, it started off, I mean, I don't know if you could ever consider Dune like normal. There was always some kind of surreal aspects to it. But as he went on, like his wife divorced him. I think some other bad stuff happened to him, and his books just got really weird. I think once it started getting to like Children of Dune or some of the other ones, some of the later ones, I'm not sure. Let me look up. I think it was like Dune, House Harkonnen, that kind of stuff. Oh no, that one was made by Brian Herbert. It was stuff like, I'll just leave it at that. His like later works started getting really weird and nonsensical. And the Dune franchise is kind of hard to get into. I haven't read Dune yet. I've seen the movies, but I've known people who started it and then stopped the book. They just couldn't finish it. If Will comes back on the podcast, he can probably explain the whole franchise pretty well, how it affects stuff like Star Wars, that kind of thing. But point being, the guy used a lot of LSD when he was making that Unmade Dune movie. Not sure what I was getting at by saying that, but that's kind of the point of the podcast. Just go wherever the discussion takes us. So short-term improvement, it has a benefit for, and I say that it might give people the jump start they need, but there's also retention across plenty of stuff. It does show a lot of retention for alcoholism and neurotic symptoms. It does have retention over a long period of time. I'm not saying it all has short-term benefit. I'm just saying that's a criticism, but even if that is the case for some, that is still worth pursuing in psychiatry, because it's an option to help people. Even if it's a small benefit, that might just be what they need for further improvement. Similar to patients suffering from PTSD, patients suffering from with neurotic symptoms who have previously been treatment resistant, psychedelics such as LSD could be an avenue that could provide a change or help them adopt a new perspective that they have been looking for in their treatment. A counter-argument against psychedelic treatment might be that substances are dangerous and not safe to use due to the effects these substances have on the brain. A source that elaborates on this well is YouTube video, What LSD Does to the Brain by Institute of Human Anatomy. The host of the channel, Justin Cottle, gives details on how different dosages of LSD affect the brain. Low amounts are called microdosing, and high amounts are called macrodosing, like I said earlier. Psychedelic treatment often includes macrodosing since it has more of an effect. Some might say this is unnecessary, but Cottle in the video details that almost any dosage wears off by the next day. This might be a bit of an exaggeration in a way. I mean, I wouldn't recommend giving like high dosages of LSD to just everyone. That's what the issue with MKUltra was, but you can generally just take any amount you want and you'll be fine the next day. So while I'm not saying you need to risk it, just take like tons of LSD and then go work at a local fast food restaurant. But it might make the shift more fun. Give you that, but it may not be a good idea. But chances are you'll be fine. There are chances of relapse and that kind of thing under high dosages, but like I say, there can be abuse of these substances. That's why professional administration of these substances professional administering of these substances is important to ensure it's done safely. That's what differentiates recreational use from professional use, is you're using it in a setting that's professional. But generally, take any amount, you'll be fine. In a psychiatric setting, professional administration of LSD in this case would be the appropriate dosage for any client to ensure safety and efficient treatment. It should be noted that different substances have a different effect. Although LSD is the most popular example, because of LSD wearing off and being professionally administered, this shows more of a benefit than a risk to patients who are considering a psychedelic treatment. And like I said, I don't think everyone should do it. It should be an option for people who are treatment resistant. It's just, there's different types of therapy. There's cognitive behavioral therapy, there's play therapy, there's all kinds of different types of psychoanalysis. And people respond in different types. In fact, one extreme version of therapy that boggles my mind is there was a guy who did an experiment. He just brought a bunch of people, random people who were, facing different tribulations and adversities in their life. The type of stuff you need treatment for with with therapy. He took them all into his apartment, and then he would just yell at them, like, just rip them apart like a drill sergeant, or maybe even worse. And somehow, miraculously, they actually helped them. Like, they actually showed improvement from this guy just yelling at them. But, this makes me think of a few things. Sometimes when there are harder things at hand, you might forget other things you're facing. That's why I think a lot of, the stress and depression, anxiety that humanity faces these days could just be from being dormant. Like, we used to have to be, like hunter-gatherer societies that bring up hunter-gatherer societies all the time. But, back then, everyone was working together. Men and women were working together. Race didn't really matter either. It was just everyone was working together for the goal of survival. There was no excess or a real They may have had a downtime, but, then they just pick up their work the next day, and then they're taking it day by day. Once people started, farming, they started settling down, then eventually civilizations in Mesopotamia, Sumeria, that kind of thing. That's when people started sitting down. Then you have stuff like Code of Hammurabi and that other early legal texts outlining laws and that kind of thing. And then people start, trading stuff like excess. Like you'll have stuff like gold and that kind of stuff. And it just, someone might be making like pants or, whatever their equivalent to clothes were back then. And someone might say, well, these jeans are better than those jeans. I'd rather have the pants this guy makes or this guy makes. And then the whole system falls apart because people want certain things over others. So that's where trade comes from. They're trading each other things. They want things that one culture has, and they'll exchange things for other cultures. And this leads to greed because the upper class, or the bourgeoisie in the case of Europe, was, hoarding all the wealth, and the lower class was just suffering, having to work for the upper class. This is seen in the Great Depression, Industrial Revolution, and the USSR. There was many injustices done under the USSR, but one thing you can't deny is that they had work for everyone. During the Great Depression, that was very enticing. There was no jobs in the United States, so a lot of people immigrated to the USSR because there's no shortage of work to be done in the USSR. Everyone is working, and they cut out the middleman. They cut out just the people solely profiting, like people like landlords who are just profiting from other people trying to make a living. Instead, they're working under communism, and they're all working towards a common goal. But putting that much power towards the government is an obvious way for abuse to happen, and then eventually the government starts screwing people over. So the best way I can kind of illustrate Marxist ideology is kind of like Darwin. The conversation of Darwinism has moved past Charles Darwin. Ongoing research proves more things that Darwin never put forward. But if you want to go back to the origin, pun intended, of the conversation, then you go back to Darwin to see where the conversation started. Same with Marx. There's Marxist ideologies on the left, on the right, and in fact, USSR under Stalin was pretty much a dictatorship. Well, is. And that has parallels like Nazi Germany. In fact, the gulags under the USSR are comparable to the Holocaust. So, it's like when you have extremes on the left or the right, eventually they meet at the middle. And, that's not always the case, but there are certain extreme political things that can happen across the political spectrum or political compass to undermine people. So, the ideas of Marx aren't exclusive to communism, aren't exclusive to the USSR, aren't exclusive to Cuba or China, and China isn't even really communist anymore. These ideas can transcend just Marx himself. I mean, I don't agree with what Marx said about religion, where he thinks it's old and needs to be abolished, but that's no different than some of the jumps in logic that Darwin made there that were elaborated upon further, and then the discussion went past him to modern science. So it's not like the way science works is you don't have to accept all of it. You just accept the parts that work, and then with ongoing research, you keep the parts that work, and then you reject the old research that's unsubstantiated with new research, and then that becomes the new scientific consensus. This can apply to Marx as well. I don't agree with what he said about abolishing religion. I think religious freedom is very important in this country, or any country, I should say. So I might agree with some things about private property or limiting billionaires or that kind of thing, or some socialist ideas such as universal health care, but I don't have to agree with what he says about religion. So he's a philosopher, and people will read Nietzsche. I always mispronounce his name as Nietzsche, but Nietzsche. If you read his works, he has like some kind of near-Nazi ideals, but his sister was putting those in, obviously. When you're reading it, you're like, oh, dang, this guy's a Nazi, which he's not. But like I said, when you're reading it, that's what you think. And the Nazis did kind of use some of his ideas. So you don't have to like everything he's saying. If you're reading a philosopher, you don't have to agree with everything. Just keep the parts you like, and then just reject the parts that you don't like. You can pick it apart. You can think about it critically. It's not take it or leave it. You can think about it, and you can come up with your own ideas based on it as a springboard. And that, in the case of like George Orwell, it doesn't really matter who the person was too. The message is what matters. People will criticize George Orwell for doing a lot of weird things, and yeah, he was a real weird guy in real life, but his message is different. Like, there's plenty of artists who are really weird. Salvador Dali, that guy's really weird. Van Gogh, that guy was also really weird, but their art is good. So that's the part that matters, and they're dead anyway. So it's not like we're giving money to like an evil person anymore. But that's enough of a tangent for now. Psychedelic therapy is also not exclusive to PTSD or neurotic symptoms. There's a lot of applications for psychedelic therapy. And in the article by Rafael G. dos Santos, and his article is called Antidepressive, Anxiolytic, and Anti-Addictive Effects of Ayahuasca, Psilocybin, and Lysergic Acid Diethylamine, that's just LSD, Systematic Review of Clinical Trials published in the last 25 years. The article uses secondary research and compiled data from various studies between 1990 and 2015 for the research. The article shows how effective these hallucinogens are when put against each other and what these substances can be used to treat. The article has promising results such as reduction in alcohol dependence along various checkups that were set up along a 9-month span using psilocybin. Reduction in daily smoking for subjects who were tobacco dependent using psilocybin. And STAI reduction in subjects who have anxiety related to life-threatening diseases. And STAI stands for State Trait Anxiety Inventory, which is a way to, it's a psychological test used to measure anxiety levels. And the STAI reductions were for subjects who have anxiety related to life-threatening diseases. So, like, some doctor says, "Oh, you got stage 2 cancer, you're going to die in 9 months," that kind of thing. Or, "You might die in 9 months." So you're getting, reasonably so, I'd be anxious too. You're getting anxious about, dying in 9 months or the chance of dying in 9 months. So that's where LSD is supposed to help you understand it from a different point of view to help reduce anxiety. Between all these results, a clear process of treatment is apparent, as well as benefit to the patient. Clear retention is also shown within the results. The benefit of this source is that it shows promising data for various diagnoses, which are otherwise hard to treat. For people who have been afflicted with PTSD, major depressive disorder, alcoholism, and while some may criticize this study for its relatively small sample size, and this is a valuable criticism of the research methods, the subjects showed increased benefits opposed to the control group. So, I've read multiple studies, and it kind of corroborates this. Even if the sample size is low, they did still show benefit. So I don't really think that criticism holds much weight, although it is still valuable. Because, you should be able to be thinking critically of these things, because, academics will still disagree all the time. One of the leading causes for stigma against psychedelic research is the various unethical experiments conducted by the U.S. government. I already brought up MK Ultra, MK Nomi, Project Artichoke, and the hypothetical Project Monarch, which is worth an episode of its own. It gets into some kind of like reptilian conspiracy stuff, which is ridiculous, but it's still funny and interesting, but that's for another episode. In the case of the article written by Colin A. Ross, which is called LSD Experiments by the United States Army, he mentions the Edgewood Army Base experiments, which are just as unethical as MK Ultra or MK Naomi. The article goes over various unethical tests in Edgewood Army Base, which is the focus of the article. The article goes over a variety of historical experiments ranging from LSD, mustard gas, nerve toxin, etc. The standout part of this article is the case studies conducted by Ross, which is with the different subjects who underwent testing at Edgewood. The case studies report psychotic episodes, hallucinations, recurring nightmares, severe depression, flashbacks, mood swings, etc. The results show a stark contrast between modern psychiatric administering of these psychedelics opposed to the test being done at Edgewood Army Base, not just due to the legality, but also due to the consent and having a clear method for continued research. Critics of psychedelic research may argue that the effects of these tests prove negative effects of psychedelics, while the Edgewood tests were unethical, illegal, and poorly managed. This is not the case for modern psychedelic research. What sets apart modern psychedelic research is that it is done in a safe environment, which is crucial for using substances such as LSD recreationally or non-recreationally. Similar to dreaming, there is a risk of a bad trip. There is also a risk of risk of a bad dream. There's a risk of a bad trip for LSD. In order to lower the risk of a bad trip, a comforting and safe room is crucial, as well as professional being present to reel the patient back in if the patient begins to dissociate or feeling negative emotions. This can be a few different ways. You can be at a table and you can grasp the person's hand, the client's hand, and be like, it's okay, affirm them. You can help ground them back into reality. Maybe you can have them focus on their surroundings, maybe focus on focus on a particular object the therapist is holding, just some method to get them anchored back into reality, which is, I'm sure they would be trained in. And, sometimes, the reward is greater than the risk as well. The overall benefit of this article is that it shows the evolution of psychedelic research, and because the experiments like the Edgewood tests, precautions are put into place to ensure a safe and beneficial experience with psychedelics. So I would like to also elaborate on Edgewood in general. It's there's some kind of goofy aspects, although it is very serious, I should say. There was one guy they're testing mustard gas on him after he signed up for just testing different military gear. Kind of like what I said with MKUltra, you sign up for one thing, and then pretty soon you're in a sensory deprivation tank with LSD in the dark, and you haven't eaten in 3 days. Crap like that. So, they're getting all these people, signing them up for tests on their army base, and then they're just inject to them all these substances, put them on LSD, all this crap. And the case studies were a follow-up by Ross, and what he did was he just found all the people who were tested on, and like I said with MKUltra, some people were compensated, and same with Edgewood. Some were compensated, but other people were deemed not abused enough to be compensated, which is ridiculous. Anyone who even had contact with those tests should be compensated, because it's unethical, no matter the severity. Abuse is abuse. So, but that does not deny that some of the case studies were a little interesting, to say the least. There was one guy who had recurring nightmares about snakes. Had a strong aversion to snakes, going out of his way to avoid seeing pictures of snakes. There was a guy who blamed LSD on his divorce, which, I don't know, if I got divorced, I'd probably blame it on LSD too. Or there's a guy who blames it on blames his alcohol addiction on LSD. There's a wide variety of case studies provided, and I think not all of them, I think they should be analyzed with a critical lens, because not all of them are really symptoms of, abuse of these substances. It would have to be some sort of other effect or stimuli paired with LSD, which would exacerbate the problem, I think. That's my idea. But the point mainly is that's not really the point. The point is just to show how unethical these tests were, regardless of these case studies. The history of Edgewood shows the abuse very well with the mustard gas, LSD, just non-consensual and unethical tests. Is just the case studies, or in addition to that, also show the severity, even if a critical lens should be applied to these tests, to these case studies, I mean. There's another one. This is the most bizarre one. It was a subject had an intense phobia of salt shakers. And this is kind of similar to Little Albert with classical conditioning. Basically, there was an orphaned baby, and then they tried to condition the baby to be afraid of furry objects. So they would get a rabbit or a dog or a stuffed animal or something, and then they'd show it to Albert, to Little Albert, and they'd hit a metal pole. They'd hit 2 metal poles together, with this loud clanging sound, and then it would obviously scare Albert, and then he would start crying. So then they were doing that over and over again, pairing it with the stimuli, the unconditioned stimulus, and then they're conditioning him to fear those objects in association with the loud banging. So then eventually they would just show him a rabbit, and then he would start crying because he associated it with the metal pole, and then with the metal bar, and then eventually there was just a famous image of a guy wearing a Santa Claus beard, And then it shows little Albert crying and it's showing that even a symbol of like a positive symbol among children, which is Santa Claus, is seen negatively by Albert because he's conditioned to fear it. And an interesting side note, people always share that story, but they never really talk about what happened to Albert. And what happened to Albert was we don't really know. There's a few different people who have been identified as little Albert over the years. One guy, I think this guy isn't Albert, he turned out relatively normal, except for when you bring animals nearby him. And he'd be a normal guy, then you would like say, oh, here's my dog, and you just like get really mad for no reason. And no one knew why this was until he realized he's a little Albert. But I doubt that, because I don't think that kind of abuse, I mean, it might, that early on, like this kid was like, months old. That's it. I mean, memory doesn't even like really, you don't really have memories until you're about like 2 years old. So if 2 or 3 years old, if there was if that abuse did last, it would probably be in a more abstract form rather than specific to furry things. And I'm not really saying it's like a repressed memory. There's repressed memories are kind of shaky basis, but I think that it wouldn't manifest in such a specific way over those years. I think it would manifest in a different way. Is more generalized abuse, and it was also short-term abuse. It was brief, and I'm sure he got adopted and his life went on. That's why he's still unidentified for the large part, mostly, is because he was so young, and Albert wasn't even his real name. I don't think. I think they just kind of gave him that name. There was a few other people, but there was even a guy who was supposedly little Albert who committed suicide. But it's shaky evidence, like I said. And I would also like to say, with a bad trip, that's the real risk with a lot of psychedelics that's where they say always do LSD with a group. Because, if you're having a bad trip, like it's like living a nightmare, but you're awake. You're under the substance and it's a nightmare, but you're awake for it. So having people present is important, and the setting really dictates how it's going to affect you. If you are taking LSD in like a dark alleyway, of course you're going to have a bad trip. If you're taking it in like, your buddy's house, like somewhere safe, then yeah, you're going to feel better. And usually a psychiatrist, their office would be comforting to ensure not just that their patients or their clients feel good, but because to minimize the risk of a bad trip. So in addition to the promising data shown, ongoing research is ongoing. There's a test called the LSDDEP2. That's a mouthful as abbreviation, and the acronym is even worse when you read the full thing, which is Study Protocol for a Randomized Double-Dummy, Triple-Blind, Active Placebo-Controlled Parallel Groups Trial of LSD Microdosing in Patients with Major Depressive Disorder. And basically, the test is still ongoing. It's going to wrap up at the end of 2025. Basically, what it is these different people will just take LSD every day. There'll be a control group as well, and then the people doing the test don't know which one's control group and which one isn't. And then they'll check up, and there'll be like various checkups. They'll monitor their effects along the way. And if you read the outline, like if you look up LSDDEP2 study, the whole like outline, it is incredibly detailed, almost foolproof compared to MKUltra, where basically MKUltra, they were even doing tests on other experimenters. Like they would just get bored and they just put LSD in their coworkers' drink. Like they weren't even like limiting it to just the subjects. They were doing it to each other too. Like MKUltra was so like comically unprofessional that anything is better than MKUltra basically. So contrasting the LSD-EP2 with MKUltra, it's like night and day. Like they're in no way comparable. That's the whole point of this. This episode is that destigmatizing psychedelics, and people might listen to this and be like, oh, I don't know, I'm not sure I'd be okay with LSD being legal. I'm not sure, recreationally or non-recreationally, but it's hard to overcome. Like, I'm not saying people can't criticize what I'm putting forward here. It's just the ideas people have of these substances is not what it actually is. It's yeah, sure, there are risks involved. If you have psychotic tendencies, it can eventually develop into stuff like schizophrenia. But there's multiple things that have that risk. Marijuana has that risk. I've heard even meditation has that risk under certain conditions. And if you're psychotic, you may already be at the risk of developing schizophrenia just in general without these substances. But like I say, there's risks involved, but in a professional setting, as I've said before, as I've said multiple times, it's the benefit outweighs the risk. And compared to the Edgewood Army-based tests, the LSD-EP2 is a lot better. And because of the promise in treating PTSD, alcoholism, and neuroticism, and the extensive outline in the LSD-EP2, this shows a clear benefit to researching psychedelics and using psychedelics in treatment. Because of this, psychedelic research should be further destigmatized and research should continue. So, this is kind of a call to action because research has been halted, and I think it only really resumed in like the 90s or so because MK Ultra just killed it. Same with the hippie movement. People just assumed oh, you're taking LSD, well, you must be like Charles Manson, And honestly, there were so many cults in the 60s, but at a certain point, the 60s were a hard time to live. There's just so many politics, there's just so many things going on, Vietnam. It was even post-World War II. People were just sick of war. I mean, I can almost see the appeal of joining, one of those weird hippie cults, those communes in the middle of nowhere. We're just constantly having sex and just, taking drugs. If you're just trying to numb yourself, I guess good place to be, but that's still dangerous. Even if you're, it's not safe to join a random hippie cult and take psychedelics and just, taking Molly every day. So that kind of reputation among hippies killed it. So because it's so far in the future, we're beyond that now. There's no hippies, in the streets anymore. That means we should continue the research. Despite this stigma, it's been long enough that we should be able to move past that now and see what these substances can be used for. In summary, while there are criticisms and stigma against psychedelic therapy, ongoing research yields promising results, which can help treatment-resistant patients pursue a new avenue for treatment, which shows retention and benefit if administered in a safe environment by professionals. I think I have illustrated all these points well, even if it is, let's see, what time are we at? We're at an hour. Thought this was only take 45 minutes, but I want to be in detail, even if I went on random weird tangents. But, and like I say, personally, I don't think I would do, LSD, because, like I say, risk of some psychotic symptoms, but not to mention it's illegal. But if I was, for some reason, addicted to alcohol, it might be something I'd consider. Like I say, recreational versus non-recreational. I don't think I'd ever do it recreationally, but in a psychiatric setting, and if I'm treatment resistant, it seems like a good avenue to pursue. It may not be for everyone, but for those people who are treatment resistant, it's worth trying. That'll be everything for this episode. I hope everyone's enjoyed the recent episodes that have been made. I kind of pumped out a lot of them recently for April 20th. And with the Insurrection Act, I haven't heard if the Insurrection Act was passed. Maybe Trump hasn't read the report yet or something, or it passed, but just the news didn't pick it up. In terms of protests, I was, looking over a subreddit for, just my local area, and all the posts were about protesters, and there was a lot of people in Utah that's, very conservative. And I'm not saying everyone conservative is in favor of the Insurrection Act. Someone can be conservative and not in favor of Trump. But the people who are most against the Insurrection Act are those on the left. But it can be a non-partisan thing. United Healthcare. I don't think the whole United Healthcare thing is a partisan issue. People have been saying the death of Brian Thompson is mainly a thing on the left, but everyone has healthcare. It doesn't need to be a partisan issue, and I'm not saying I condone the death of Brian Thompson. The thought of just killing people randomly isn't a very good thought, but the discussion it provoked, I don't think that discussion is strictly on the left. I think the right can engage in it too to understand, because if you are on the right and you're saying, okay, I don't want universal health care, you probably still want the most you can get out of your health care, even privatized. So from that perspective, I think this discussion with insurance and healthcare applies to the right as well, and they should be included in the discussions so that it's not one-sided. When people are fighting amongst themselves, no progress is being made. If you get a bunch of people who are pro-choice and pro-life with abortion, put them in the room, they might actually find some common ground. They might say, okay, we're against having more than this amount of abortions per year, or against abortion past this stage. We want maybe abortion only under these conditions, that kind of thing. There might be some common ground, but when we're keeping it divided by partisan politics, then we're not getting those discussions and coming to common ground or finding a solution. We're just yelling at each other because it's like, campus. We're just going to extremes, and everyone's radicalized, and that's what like the deep state wants. They want us to fight amongst ourselves, so then we're not looking towards who's controlling us, the government. So if we come together with these kinds of issues, same with like Brian Thompson, abortion, Insurrection Act, when people come together with these issues, they can kind of start to unravel them and say, yes, while I'm conservative, or yes, while I'm liberal, I do still think, even if I agree with certain ideas, that this one in particular doesn't sit well with me. So but like I said, I was mainly seeing people on the left at these protests, but reasonably so. It's against Trump. But what I was trying to say is that not all conservatives like Trump. And the world didn't end, so that's good. Coming up, I think we'll probably talk about the Testament of Solomon soon, and I keep pushing that off. And that should be everything. If you got to the end, I'm always curious to see who gets to the end, so comment, and then do that, and that should be everything.